Now, Larp, it rhymes with lard. It's not a pretty word, but it's the word we're stuck with. And Larp comes from American English, where it means live action role playing. It's an acronym, LARP, although it's now being used as a regular word. The live action is live action as in live action movies, as opposed to, for example, animated movies. What does it mean to LARP? Here's a scene from a LARP. Is it possible to turn down the lights a little bit, because it's kind of hard to see this? There's a scene from a LARP. To the right here we have a young gentleman who was abandoned as a child on a garbage heap. One day he meets an anthropologist to the left who's out studying the people who live in the garbage heap. He invites her for a date. And they sit there. This is a photo taken from an actual LARP. They sit there role-playing. And what makes this role-playing, what makes this LARPing, is that he's constantly pretending to be his character. His real name is Frederick, and he's a movie producer. And she is constantly pretending to be her character. And in their interactions, she is confirming his idea that I am this character, and she is confirming his idea. If she would go, no, stop that, you're just role-playing, then they would no longer be LARPing. But as long as they're both continue reinforcing each other's idea that they are their respective characters, that they are in this world where people live in the garbage heap and have dates there, then they're role-playing. Now, role-playing is often contrasted or compared with theatre. And this could be theatre, this could be a movie. It's hard to tell just from the picture. And in fact, the scene I just showed you, this picture, it happened somewhere around there. This is the centre of Oslo where this LARP was played. And there were hundreds of people standing up here watching down, so they had observers. Live role-playing is different from theatre and movies, not because we don't have audiences. We usually don't, but we can have them. But because we don't care about the audience. They are not LARPing for the sake of the people looking up, standing up and looking down on them. They are all playing for each other's sake, for the experience of this moment. Around the world, if you mention LARP, a lot of people would either say LARP or LARP, or you mean like the stuff with the costumes in the forest and the weapons? Stuff that looks like this, fantasy live role-playing. And that is probably still the most popular genre of role-playing around the world, although there's a lot of variety between countries and between cities and so on in what exactly it means to do fantasy live role-playing. And yes, this is LARP. This is the most common genre of LARP in the world today. But there are also many other kinds of LARP. There are people who pretend for 5 days to be fishermen living in the air in 1942. There are people pretending to be corrupt advertising executives in our present day. There are people pretending to be on dates in relationships that are about to go really, really bad. There are people who role-play musicals and every once in a while stop role-playing to begin singing and dancing. There are people who role-play as part of educational initiatives at their school. There are people who pretend to be on spaceships in the distant future, a galaxy far, far away, moving stuff around on screens to hit the enemy spaceships. There are people pretending to be living in the world of Harry Potter. There are people pretending to be a Stone Age tribe. There are people doing stuff that's hard to explain in words, but this is still LARP. LARP is big and LARP is diverse. I've been updating this map. This is not an accurate map, but it's the best map we have of where there is LARP. And every year, when I do this at the summer school, somebody says, I know there are LARPers in Paraguay. And so I'll have to update the map a little bit more. As of now, there's only one big white spot left, which is the continent of Africa. And I suspect that might just be because we don't know how to translate LARP into Bantu languages. But where does this all come from? After all, that's what I'm here to talk about. What's the history of LARP? And if you ask LARPers around the world, you will get a lot of very different histories. And some people will say that, we started in the 19th century with the original LARPer of our nation, who was this guy. And some people will say, I invented it all in the year 1970. And we had 500 people in glorious costumes. But that was boring, so I'm not doing it any longer. I find reason to doubt a lot of these stories that have been told locally. So when I was asked to do this lecture the first year, I sat down to do my own research. And there are a lot of things that look like LARP around the world. some of the sources we did have, some of the people who had been writing about the history of Larp before, had drawn parallels to ancient Egyptian spectacle, you could say. They had drawn parallels to the proto-Greek theatre, the stuff they were doing before they wrote the plays that we now know the Greek theatre for. They had drawn parallels, such as this is started, to the pageantry of European courts in the 17th and 18th century. But all of these things are things that are being discovered now. And all of these parallels in history are parallels that we discover now. We don't know if the people who started LARPing in your local scene were aware of what Queen Elizabeth I was doing. Most likely they were not, or it had no impact on the decision to begin LARPing. So instead, I have been following the words, live-action role-playing. Now, where does role-playing come from? And that's interesting, because you can't really find any mention of role-playing before the 20th century. And by following the thread of the word role-playing, we can now state definitely, almost definitely, the time and the place where role-playing began. And it was here, Vienna, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, which no longer exists, and the 1910s. It says 1910-ish because we don't have any more exact date than that. In Augarten in Vienna, this is a part of the Imperial Palace Gardens, but it's also open to the public, so it was a popular place for children to come and play. And in the 1910s, the children of Augarten began talking about a strange foreigner, a young man wearing an imposing black cloak who would hang around the park, observing them as they played. But they rather liked this young man with a foreign accent. He would observe their games, he would come with cues, suggest, maybe you should play this, maybe you should play that. He would tell stories, he was a great storyteller, sometimes climbing up in the trees, sitting on the branches and telling stories from there. This man's career as a storyteller and friend to local children ended when these children started refusing to join activities their parents had planned for them, because they would rather go play with the mysterious dark foreigner in the park. At which point this young man was counseled to stop visiting the gardens of Augarten. But he brought with him from these gardens an idea that children's play is so free and spontaneous, and that the behavior he saw amongst these children was something he also felt was lacking amongst the adults in the society around him. And that perhaps by reclaiming some of that spontaneity of childhood into adulthood, we might become better people. The next time we encounter the young man is in the 1915-ish. Again, as I write ish because the only source we have is the young man's memoirs, which are a bit vague. We don't know if this actually happened. It might be that it was only something he wanted to have happened. But at least we are in 1915-ish. World War I has started. Europe is chaos. And somebody is performing Also sprach Zarathustra, Nietzsche's book, now adopted as a theatre play in Vienna, standing up on stage, being very pompous. Zarathustra is a very, very, very pompous book, talking about the coming of the overman and stuff like that, at which point a member of the audience, the same young man with the imposing black cloak, jumps up on stage and demands, "What right have you to speak the words of Zarathustra? You are not Zarathustra. You are merely reciting from a script written for you by someone else. Truly, if you wish to speak as Zarathustra, you must stand before us as Zarathustra," or something along those lines. Needless to say, it probably caused a bit of a scandal, and the young man was promptly evicted from the theatre. Until the year 1921, when the young man now has become wealthy enough to rent a theatre, the Comedian Theater in Vienna. And this is a very special time in the history of Vienna. World War I is over, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is no more, there is a new country, Austria, and there is a new age. The citizens of Vienna read an invitation in the local newspaper inviting them to come to a special evening at the Comedian Theater, a place which is usually associated with light-hearted vaudeville, dancing, comedy, that kind of stuff. Enough people come, they pay for tickets, they come in and are greeted with an empty throne on stage. And onto the stage, next to the empty throne, stands a man who the audience would call the poet, who challenges them. He asks, "Here there sat an emperor, but neither the empire nor the emperor are any more. Who shall lead us now? What qualities should a man have to be deserving to sit in this chair? Any of you people, perhaps? Who is deserving? And in this way, he challenges them. And after a while, they get the idea. They're supposed to actually answer. It's a theatre, but they're supposed to actually speak back. And some people propose themselves and their friends and their dogs and so on. And this is discussed. The poet picks it up. Why then should he be deserving? Why should she be deserving? Why should her dog be deserving? Okay, I'm making things up a little bit, but it was something along those lines. And so a political discussion occurs. A symbolic discussion about the future of the nation of Austria and of politics. The audience get along with this, and in the end the poet has a speech where he reiterates these big questions of our age. The curtains are drawn, people applaud, and then they wait for the dancing to come. And nothing happens. This we have sources for because people then wrote angry letters to the newspaper about being defrauded at the theatre. And the young man of these stories was, of course, the same man, and his name was Jacob Levi Morino. He came to Vienna from Romania, which was at that point a part of the empire, in order to study medicine. He was the oldest son of a Sephardic Jewish family that lived in Romania since the day of the Ottoman Empire. And he would spend most of his life, in fact, not in Vienna, but in the United States, where he immigrated in the 1920s. But his formative years, the years where all these ideas pop up, are the years he spent in Vienna. In Vienna, this man obsessed with bringing spontaneity back to adults. He tried to establish 3 different forms. He opened something called the Theatre of Spontaneity, undeterred by the failure of the audience at the comedy theatre to appreciate his work. He opened his own theatre, wherein people would come and observe improvisational theatre. This was the first time in the history of Europe where purely improvisational theatre was shown on stage. Just to prove to people that the actors were in fact improvising, Morino's typical performance would be a living newspaper, where he would take a story from today's newspaper, preferably one that had been published right before the play began, and say, okay, Lenin has done this, let's make a play. Our dog was killed in somewhere else in Vienna, let's make this a play. And then the actors would improvise from there. Morino, also a student of medicine and after a while a licensed doctor and psychiatrist. This is of course Vienna, early 20th century. Freud is active, Jung is active. There are all these psychotherapists, psychoanalysts and so on active. Morino would take his ideas of spontaneity and drama and introduce them to the idea of therapy, establishing something called psychodrama. In a psychodrama, there is no audience as such. Everyone who participates is a participant of sorts, although people might be observing for a long time. Morino would go in the role of the director. He would ask, so who here has something they would like to bring into the play? People would be like, well, you know, I'm still dealing with my difficult relationship with my father. I suffer from stage fright and anxiety. People would propose different topics coming from their own lives. Morino would make a selection. It's okay if we work with this, the difficult relationship with the father. The audience would come to some kind of agreement, and then they would play through that scene. Okay, show us a scene where you had a problem with your father. Could you pretend to be the father? Okay, brief me. The father, what is he like? And then they would role play through that. Afterwards, the director would suggest changes. What if the father behaved in this way? What if you sit down? You, over there, could you step in and take the role of the son? Let's play it again. And then they would discuss it. What changed? What have we learned? In the end of every psychodrama session, there is something called the sharing, whereby people talk about their subjective experience, whether they were on the stage or not. They talk through what they saw and what it meant to them. And in almost every psychodrama session ever held, the same thing is said. This relates to me. I too have experienced this. Even if I haven't had a difficult relationship with my father, what I saw on stage resonates with my difficult relationship with other people in my life. In psychodrama, it tends to show that people are all struggling with many of the same questions and the same issues. And by bringing them up on stage through psychodrama, people experience catharsis, emotional cleansing. In addition to psychodrama, Moreno experimented with something called social drama, which was a big part of his work in the 20s and 30s, where he would basically do to a group what psychodrama did for an individual. Okay, so you people are a company. Now let's sit down and have a meeting. Okay, boss, you, the boss, out. You are now the boss, in. Okay, let's continue the meeting. Okay, boss, so what have we learned about our meeting culture now? And in addition to this, Moreno would experiment with something called sociometrics. This lives on today under the name of network analysis, where we would map out the relationships between different people, using diagrams to do so. Famously, Moreno, after migrating to the US in the late 20s, worked with a school for troubled young women, went into the school, mapped out every relationship between the people there, then used social drama to try to improve the functioning of the school. Also came with recommendations to the school for which people should stay in which houses as a way to break up enduring conflicts. And also as part of this work began very early on with dealing with issues of racial tension, which were also the case at the school, which then began involving the teachers. So Moreno's sociometric maps began including teachers as well as part of this institution. This established Moreno as a bit of a social scientist, and throughout the 30s he also published something called the Journal of Sociometry, and in later years was mostly known to the general public as the father of psychodrama, but in scientific circles as the father of sociometry, and an early sociologist. The fact that sociologists today talk about roles, as well as us people talking about role-playing, is not entirely a coincidence. Moreno was one of the people who popularized the concept of role in the social sciences. Psychodrama today is a bit of it's still a thing. You can go to psychodrama instructors in most cities in Europe, but it's not a big thing. Psychodrama's influence is felt much more through the many forms of therapy that psychodrama has influenced. Stuff such as Gestalt therapy, experiments such as those done by, well, we could call them hippies or alternate consciousness enthusiasts at the SLN Institute in the 1970s. So Moreno's influence in the world of therapy and self-development is pretty thorough, although it's not often credited under the term psychodrama. This here is a diagram of the history of role-playing. We have just received our first boxes. I'm afraid it might be a bit hard to read them from the back. That's okay. This diagram is online. But we basically have a line from the 1920s up to the present of therapeutic role-play, beginning with Moreno. There are other people, though, who talk about role-playing, and they are not us, and they are not Moreno, and they are not psychodrama people. Viola Spolin, one of the most important figures in improvisational theatre, talks about role-playing. Her son, Paul Sills, using many techniques he learned from his mother, founded something called the Compass Players, which is then one of the oldest kind of continuous traditions of improvisational theatre. They were active in Chicago, and this style of improvisation is these days called Chicago-style improv. Spolin, again, was interested in education. She introduced the idea of theatre games, improvisational exercises, that was used in training actors, but also could be used in training people who were not of the ambition to become actors, in increasing spontaneity. The world of theatre improv is really annoying, because these theatre people almost never cite their sources. So you have a guy called Keith Johnstone, who's maybe the most popular authority on theatre improvisation today, who writes a lot about theatre improv, and he almost never cites any sources of influence. But he started in the 1970s, and Spolin started in the 1930s. So I think it's fair to place credit where it belongs, with Spolin. And so we get a new set of boxes here at the bottom here. Viola Spolin starting up the modern theatre improv world, influencing people like Keith Johnstone. And I also have a number of other artists who have experimented with improvisation. Maybe with influence from these other artists, maybe not. But the idea of improvisation pops up in the work of such theatre gurus as Jerzy Grotowski from Poland, Augusto Boal from, I forget the country, but he was active all over the world. So you encounter more and more improvisation in the world of theatre and drama as the 20th century goes on. And then there is another group of people who also talk about role-playing, and those are the social scientists. Especially this guy, Kirk Lewin, Another European who migrated to the Americas, he migrated in the late 30s. Originally from Germany, of Jewish descent, hence the migration. Was fairly active in the world of in establishing the field of social psychology in the 1940s. Lewin died in 1947, so a lot of the work of Lewin was continued by his students. Things like the Stanford Prison Experiment. Who here has heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment? A lot of people, yes. Brief summary for those who haven't. A researcher invites people to pretend to be prisoners and guards. They pretend to be prisoners and guards for a week, and things get increasingly brutal. Stanford Prison Experiment has been criticized a lot in modern days as not really a valid experiment, but it definitely used role-playing as its method. This is found in the academic literature, that this was a role-playing style of research. In addition to using role-playing in academic research, Lewin was also involved in various education efforts and training efforts during World War II, also with the American military, that they would use role-playing techniques in order to practice group cohesion, to train officers, things like that. And there is a still living tradition of using role-playing in military education that stems back to this man. Now, another influence that probably stems from Kurt Lewin and his use of role-playing is one of the most fascinating anecdotes in history of modern role-playing, is how they used role-playing at the RAND Corporation in the US in the 1950s. Now we're in the 1950s, the Cold War is a thing. Nuclear war is a threat. This gentleman here, Herman Kahn, associated with the RAND Institute, the RAND Corporation, was researching how to win a nuclear war. He was the inspiration for Dr. Strangelove, for those who have seen that movie. They were trying to figure out, if there is a nuclear war, who will win it. And they devised all kinds of simulation techniques using primitive computers, dice, rules, and so on in order to play simulation games. And eventually realized that they were lacking the human factor. Because in the end, there are human beings either pressing the red button or not pressing the red button. So they started using role-playing in order to simulate also this part of a possible nuclear war. They had 4 role-playing political games, role-playing strategic simulation games, whereof the last one lasted, I think, 2 weeks, wherein they had brought in people from academia and from the State Department to pretend to be both the White House and the decision makers at the White House and the Politburo in the Kremlin. And these would sit in separate rooms, and then they would deliberate what we're going to do now. And then the games masters, the control room, would come in and send them telefaxes or telegrams that, oh, okay, there is an insurrection in Ingushetia. And then they would have to determine how to react to that. This is in some ways similar to many modern LARPs. The RAND Corporation eventually stopped playing around with role-playing. They felt it was not worth the effort, because after all these human factors were kind of fishy and wibbly and wobbly, and it was hard to pin down into exact science. But a lot of people who visited them during these games, people from the State Department, people from academia, they returned to their respective institutions and continued to want to use role-playing, because they were engaged, they had a great time. And although the facts were hard to pin down, the understanding they got from this role-playing experience was, they felt, invaluable. And so from these experimental games there came a tradition of using role-playing in political science as an educational method, which started with PhD students, and eventually people were doing using the same techniques with primary school students. So by now we're getting a pretty complete map. We have the RAND Corporation people influencing educational role-play. Kurt Lewin's work also influencing through training the world of educational role-play. We have the theater improvisation people here. We have the therapy people here. And they're all talking about role-playing, using the term role-playing. Still, we haven't arrived at LARP. Now, a point of credit there, because a lot of these people have been kind of working as if they were the ones inventing role-playing. Lewin's students have referenced Lewin, nobody before Lewin. The theatre improv people have referenced Keith Johnstone or Viola Spolin, but nobody before them. There has been some recent work, quite interesting work, done in part by Jacob Levere Morino's son, Jonathan Morino, tracking the lines of influence further back. At which point we discover that Viola Spolin herself, while she did not write about it in her written books, which were mostly how to do theatre games books, she was in fact indebted to Marino. She had worked with Marino when he tried to do his improvisational theatre in New York. Not a commercial success, but still an thing of great influence. And she sometimes called her work social drama, another giveaway. Kurt Lewin, when he immigrated to the United States in the late 30s, came into contact with Jacob Lovir Marino. The two of them were in fact quite close. Marino described himself as the tutor to Lewin. I'm not sure Lewin would have agreed, but what we do know is that he published multiple papers in Marino's Journal of Sociometry. Marino, however, was not, as I implied early on, was a bit of a pompous man. Part of the reason he left Vienna in the first place was he was involved in a very long legal case about who had the rights to the ideas behind a particular set of architectural drawings. After Lewin's death in 1947, Marino fell out with Lewin's students. The conflict between them was so angry that Lewin's students eventually omitted all mention of Marino in their work. But if the lines of influence are to be drawn the right way, we see that all our base are belong to J.L. Marino. But now we're getting closer to the world of Larp. Because when people talk about the history of Larp, there are a lot of local stories, like I invented Larp in 1930. With 500 players and golden swords and so on. But the thing that most people agree on is Larp live action comes from something else called tabletop role-playing games. Hence we need to say live action to differentiate them from tabletop role-playing games. And tabletop role-playing games, they have a very definite beginning, and that's with this game, Dungeons and Dragons, written by these two gentlemen, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and published in 1974. And these gentlemen, Arneson and Gygax, they were enthusiasts of strategy games. Complex strategy games, board games, have a history within the world's militaries and military schools. But these people were not military. Or some of them might have been, but that was unimportant. Because they met with other people on the basis of a shared hobby. They had large mock battles using figures, miniatures, hexagonal maps, and rather complex rule books. Through their experimentation with their own game designs, Gygax, Arneson, and people around them began exploring a kind of game where people, instead of controlling armies, they would control individual characters. And this was what eventually became published as Dungeons and Dragons. Now, Dungeons and Dragons has a fantasy aesthetic. You can play an elf, a dwarf, you can wear chainmail armor, you run around in dungeons and try to kill things and grab their loot. The things you kill are monsters, no ethical problems here. So it's perfectly okay to kill them and grab their loot. And of course, this whole world of fantasy was pretty big at the time, in the 1970s, thanks to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Which had been published in 1954, but really came into the mainstream in the 60s and 70s. The Tolkien fandom, all the people who were passionately involved with the Lord of the Rings, kept on coming up with new ways to make the content of Lord of the Rings alive. This is an example from a Swedish group, Mykos Fylking, who have been active, I think, since the 1960s. Dungeons and Dragons, not necessarily the game, but the success of the game can be seen as an example of the same thing. People trying very hard, after reading all the books, and there are no more books to read, how do we make this world that we're so passionate about come alive? But you'll notice one word that is missing from the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Rules for fantastic medieval war games, campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. Anyone notice the missing word? Role-playing. There is no role-playing here. So where does the word role-playing come from in role-playing games? Because Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to be the first role-playing game. It turns out the word role-playing was attached to this kind of games. After there had come more of them, there was one called Tunnels and Trolls that was published very early. Not a rip-off at all. It was half the price of Dungeons & Dragons. So after there were a few of these games, the players of these games began referring to them in their own fanzines and magazines as role-playing games. The thing is, if you read the early Dungeons & Dragons, it's kind of hard to figure out how you're supposed to play these games. There are a lot of rules. There's something about moving through caves and killing monsters. Can you go out of the caves? What are you supposed to do with your character except moving him around on the map? Apparently, every single group that played Dungeons & Dragons invented their own particular way of playing Dungeons & Dragons. And the word that a lot of them used to describe what they were doing when they were playing Dungeons & Dragons was a word not from Gygax and David Arneson, but from mainstream culture around them, which was role-playing. Dungeons & Dragons became a huge hit, an enormous hit. It's kind of hard to see today just how big the game was in its heyday. But we could position the heyday in the year 1982. This is E.T., Hollywood blockbuster movie Steven Spielberg directs. And these are the main characters. They're good all-American boys, and they do things like play football and ride around on bicycles, and they play Dungeons & Dragons. It's not even explained in the movie. It's just something they do, because they're perfectly ordinary boys of their age. The same year, we have this wonderful movie featuring Tom Hanks. I'm not sure if he's proud of the movie, but it's called Mazes and Monsters, wherein a group of college students play this game called Mazes and Monsters. Please don't sue us, Dungeons & Dragons. They play the game, and then someone has this dangerous idea. You know, sitting around at a table and following rules and rolling dice is all fun and stuff, but what if we did it live? And so they go off into some old caves under their university college, and they do Dungeons and Dragons live. And this results in Tom Hanks losing his mind. So for the rest of the movie, he's walking around and being completely convinced that he is his character. This was part of a general moral panic that happened at the age. At the same time as Dungeons & Dragons became incredibly popular, it also became incredibly controversial. The controversy, of course, if you've ever been a young person, you will recognize this, that this dangerous game also becomes a lot more interesting. So it's quite possible that the controversy, the idea that Dungeons & Dragons can lead you to lose your mind, might have led a lot more people to play it than might have otherwise happened. And it certainly inspired some people to do exactly this dangerous thing, to do it live. The first LARP on record, Treasure Trap, in Britain, in Peckforton Castle, 1981, I think. There are claims that there are older LARPs, and those claims might be possible to document also. But until I see that documentation and have time to read through it, I'll stick to this idea that Treasure Trap was probably one of the first LARPs. And they had a castle to play, which was kind of awesome. The castle looked like this. And Treasure Trap is still around. It's a regular live gaming group that's active in the UK and has several chapters. But a lot of different LARP traditions around the world did not start with Treasure Trap. Sometimes you had heard that, yeah, they are doing this thing called live role-playing in this other country. Maybe we could do it here. And then they started doing live role-playing, and of course, their idea of live role-playing would probably be very different from the live role-playing as it was done in this other country. So with tabletop role-playing games, beginning with Dungeons & Dragons, they're reasonably similar around the world, because everybody has read Dungeons & Dragons or games that have been inspired by Dungeons & Dragons. Live role-playing traditions around the world are sometimes very, very different. And sometimes I didn't even know that somebody else in another country were doing live role-playing. They just made everything up from scratch. So there are a lot of people who have invented live role-playing. But they didn't get the idea, but the idea they got either from tabletops or from hearing that somebody else was doing live role-playing. So now our map is almost complete. We have come all the way up here to modern LARP. The idea of role-playing, beginning with Moreno, moving through all these other forms. Improvised theatre, therapeutic role-play fair training, research, educational role-play, up to the world of RPGs, up to the world of LARP. And then we come to modern LARP. This is not a term. You don't need to remember it. I just need to talk about what's been happening now, what's been happening the last 5 years. the last 5 to 10 years. What are all these words that people are using now? I've tried to make this map of global LARP styles, updating it for every year for the summer school. I gave up last year. This says that in the blue countries, 90% of the LARPing that's going on is kind of similar to Dungeons & Dragons. It's rules-based, combat is important, genres are important, it's fantasy or science fiction and so on. And then the green countries is not 90%, maybe less. But there are so many questions attached to this, and things are changing. And were I correct in interpreting Australian LARP as very rules-based? Maybe it isn't. But anyway, people keep telling me, no, that's not correct any longer. That was correct 10 years ago. So I've given up on updating this map. There are a lot of regional traditions. And as mentioned, since every region has had a chance to invent live role-playing by themselves, they have a slightly different interpretation on what live role-playing means. We talk about Nordic LARP, which is a broad tradition, incorporating a lot of different local traditions and ignoring some from around the Nordic countries. There is Russian language LARP. I would say Russian language because it's not just played in Russia. There are different kinds of American LARP, the live combat style, the theater style, parlor games. There's something called American freeform now. We thought we had understood American LARP. We were wrong because they kept changing it. But they can also continue breaking it down, like in Italy, every city has their own manifesto of this is LARP the way it should be, or at least the way it is in our city. And then it can break down into different neighborhoods. And so on. So the regional traditions don't really help us labeling a LARP. To say that this is an Italian LARP doesn't help us understand that much about what it is about or how it is played. Instead, we might look at this thing called the threefold model, which says that there are 3 ways of looking at role-playing. When we look at role-playing from one perspective, it looks like a game. Like you can begin understanding it in terms of rule structures. Perhaps it is competitive, people are competing, but for fun, not to actually beat each other. That's not a very precise understanding of the game, that's just common language usage of the term game. We can also look at role-playing as simulation, that we're trying to pretend that a different world, a different society, the society our characters live in, that it is real, it is coherent, it is consistent. If I do A, then B will happen. Or we can look at it as drama, as a world of creativity where we're constantly improvising, but also where narratives and stories and so on become really important ways of understanding what's going on. And you can look at any LARP, any piece of role-playing from these 3 angles. But for some LARPs, looking at it as a drama will make a lot more sense, and for other LARPs, looking at them as games will make more sense. And sometimes the sense these different angles make will be overlapping or different. But at least with these 3 different ways of looking at role-playing, we can get a little bit better understanding of the world of LARP, where you see some scenes are more into the game perspective, and other scenes, such as the Nordic world, we are more into either the simulation or the drama perspectives. We can also look at LARP through the major varieties, because there are now some recognizable forms of LARP. Most of these I won't talk about at all, but there are 3 which you will encounter at the summer school, which other speakers will talk about, which you will have a chance to play. And those are the 360-degree illusion style of LARPing, the black box style of LARPing, and the freeform style of LARPing. The 360-degree illusion is, I think the original article that introduced the term was called On the Impossibility of the 360-degree illusion. It's like, it's a goal, it's an aim, that everywhere you look, 360 degrees, everywhere you look, you will see nothing that doesn't belong in the world of the fiction. So if I'm going to play a fisherman in the year 1942, I better find my precise, exactly these clothes that they wore in 1942. I better shave my beard, because a Norwegian man in the 1940s would not have a beard. Some of these gentlemen had beautiful beards before the game. And in addition, the organizers better provide a fishing boat, which they actually had. It's not in the picture, but they went out every day fishing on a fishing boat that was an antique fishing boat. That was exactly the kind of boat that was used for fishing in the 1940s. And then we role play persistently. I don't go like, oh, well, off game, I didn't really mean that. No. I stay in character. Everything is in character, in game, all the time. I sleep in character. If I'm awake in midnight by the air siren, which did happen, then I respond as my character, not as me. That also means that I eat the fish we catch. Another example of 360-degree illusion, a spaceship Larp Monitor Celestra, where they actually built the whole control system for the spaceship. So you would have to interact with different computer terminals. There would be some people who were in charge of the reactor, and they would constantly be monitoring the displays on the reactor to make sure it didn't blow up. Stuff like that. So outside, of course, was the year 2013. Outside the spaceship, it was actually a warship, but the inside of it everything had been replaced, so it would serve the illusion of a spaceship. Then we have the black box, which you can choose to view as the anti-360, and you can choose to view it as just a different take on the same idea. In a black box Larp, it's called black box Larp because it's usually played in a black box room. Black box rooms are black walls, black floors, preferably a black ceiling, and you have available the world of theatrical lighting and of sound. So this here is a black box Larp. Here are some people who are planning a terrorist attack, and here are some policemen who are listening in on them, and that's the wall separating the two. So the people in here, of course the players can see that the police are listening in on them, but in the black box form, we choose to interpret this as a wall, and we act as if it was a wall there. But the fact that the wall isn't there is also part of the LARP. The fact that you have this meta-knowledge, so you can see the aesthetic world of the LARP is part of the point. You know, I have people left there, and we're having a phone call in the black box LARP. So we're signaling each other. But still, in a black box LARP, you might wear costumes, or you might just say that everybody has to wear black clothes to fit in with the scenography. You do use the world of visual stimuli. You use lighting, you might use some props, carefully selected props and effects, and so on. You might use balloons, for example, which are chosen for aesthetic reason, but also represent, I think it's hopes? Dreams, yes. And dreams can be popped and thereby destroyed in the game The White Death. So this is black box, and you'll be hearing more about black box later on. And then there is also something called freeform role-playing. And you actually all know what freeform role-playing is, because you've just played the Family Anderson, which is a freeform role-playing scenario. Is freeform LARP or is it something else? Depends on who you ask. It doesn't make a big practical difference. But in the freeform tradition, unlike the black box tradition, you will usually have fewer players. Like the max of a freeform is usually around the amount of people you can fit into a seminar room. Let's say 10 people. Costumes don't matter. If you're playing a freeform the way they're originally designed, you can wear whatever. They're often played in classrooms. And very often with freeform, you can have a games master or director who is in the room and who is actively directing, saying, stop. Okay, now we go to the next scene. Now you play this character and you play that character. Stuff like that. So they're using a bit of the same toolbox as the world of psychodrama. The borders between these forms are actually quite blurry. But if you look around on the internet, you will find these words, and they'll be used referring to particular traditions. And of course, you'll hear about Nordic LARP. Great wars have been fought about the meaning of the word Nordic LARP. I'm not talking about the meaning of the word Nordic LARP as in a particular style of play. I'm talking about the Nordic LARP tradition, or properly the inter-Nordic tradition. Because there are 5 Nordic countries: Iceland, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Also, we have autonomous regions, Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And the inter-Nordic tradition is about 4 of them: Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. All of these countries developed their own law tradition, multiple law traditions, beginning in the 80s or 90s. The Swedes, I think, were the earliest in the early 80s. But then, in 1997, something magic happened. A lot of us met at a conference. This conference was called Knutepunkt because it was in Norway, it had a Norwegian name. And we started talking about Larp and what we had in common, a great many things, and what separated us, also a great many things. And we misunderstood each other all the time. The Finns said, oh yeah, the rules, and we thought the Finns were like the Americans, they had like lots of rules. And it turned out, no, when the Finns said rules, they meant the printed book of information that you get before a Larp, and most of that was not rules. And when the Swedes said character, they didn't actually mean like a 10-page text writing the history of a character. They just meant something they had said to the organizer. I want to play an elf, and the organizer would be, okay, and then I was an elf. So from these like early beginnings, we began finding common language to talk about role-playing and to talk about Larp. Every year since '97, there has been a conference called Knutepunkt in Norwegian, Knudepunkt in Danish, Knutepunkt in Swedish, and Solmukohta when it's in Finland. You can guess which language is not related to the other three. So here's a typical evening. It's a strange mixture of like absolute craziness and academic conference. You can also play Larp there and so on. And these days, Solmukohta is drawing, Knutepunkt is drawing like 400 to 500 people. It's grown very big, and there are a lot of other conferences and institutions in the same network. For the last few years, people have been publishing books with articles helping us resolve this, like what do rules actually mean, those kind of questions. Now the pile of books is big enough that very few people have actually read all of them. So people these days are writing summaries. And there are more books not published at the Knutepunkt, but that are kind of referencing stuff that has been written about and talked about at Knutepunkt. There are Nordic Larps. College of Wizardry, which is probably the most famous Larp these days. It's held in Poland and it's also influenced by the Polish tradition, but has been marketed internationally as a Nordic Larp. After school in Denmark, also a famous proponent of Nordic Larp, although they rarely talk about Nordic. It's a school where you can study everything in the 10th grade curriculum in the Danish school system by ways of role-playing and gaming. The games are on the festival, which is kind of associated with the summer school, in that you'll meet a lot of the same people there. Every year held in Oslo. It's definitely part of the Nordic tradition, but the people holding their black box, it's mostly black box Larps at the games on the festival, come from all over the world. And there are people in the US practicing Nordic style, there are people in Germany practicing Nordic style, so this idea of Nordic Larp, the network of Nordic Larp has been spreading internationally. And that brings us towards our conclusion. Because as I remember, role-playing has been talked about all over the planet for almost a century. It's influenced the idea of improvised theatre, it's influenced therapy and therapeutic role-play, it's influenced how politicians and military officers train for crisis, it's influenced education both in the school system and outside of it, and it's influenced recreational play, because this was ultimately the big innovation of Dungeons & Dragons, this idea that role-playing could be done just for the fun of it, which has led us to Larp, which has then begun doing stuff like, and then Larpers do stuff like EduLarp, and they do Larp for training purposes. And they begin looking into all this stuff that's been done in the world of theatre, done in the world of therapy, done in the world of role-play training and social sciences. And so, back in the day, all our base belonged to J.L. Marino. But I'd like to end this lecture by saying that in the future, the world of role-playing belongs to us, the Larpers. Thank you.